Let's talk about Japanese poetry. We've been hanging out recently on this channel in the 20th century in American poetry, in poetry that's relatively recent. And when we talk about American poetry, we're talking about a tradition that's a couple hundred years old. But I want to look at a tradition that's much, much older. I want to talk for a few videos about Japanese poetry. Now, Japanese poetry is the kind of poetry that asks us to change our pace a bit. When we talk about Japanese poetry, we're talking about a tradition that begins, at least in written record, in the 700s AD and goes all the way up to the present. And the big areas of interest are the 700s through the 1100s, and then the 15, 16, 1700s in particular. Now, why these eras? Well, we're going to go into more detail about them in future videos. But in the 700s, there was what was called the Nara period. And in the Nara period, we start having these official collections of poems being gathered from Japan. And these poems are of various length, none of them very long, but there's a lot of variation in the early Nara period of poetry. These poems are collected most importantly in a collection called the Manyoshu. A few hundred years of development lead into the Heian period, which is around the turn of the millennia, 900s through 1100s, where we get perhaps the greatest of all Japanese literature. We have the Japanese novel emerge. But as we'll see, Japanese poetry is actually a central element of the Japanese novel in this Heian period. Japan descends into political violence in the 12th century, and it takes a while for culture to reorganize to a place where you have a stable literary culture again. That literary culture really hits a high point in the 1600s during the Tokugawa shogunate, and you have the rise of the haiku tradition, which really dominates Japanese poetry from the 1600s, arguably into the present. So Japanese poetry is going to require a broader view, a longer historical rumination and meditation, and a little bit of a changing in our expectations of what a poem should look like. As we'll see as we look through Japanese poetic history, Japanese poetry is really interested in line lengths and syllable counts. And so it shares that with Western poetry. But in not being interested in metrical structures, just given how Japanese is pronounced, and in not being interested in rhyme, other things come out. And I think one of the things that Japanese poetry is really prized for is the image. Now, it would be improper to say that Japanese poetry is only interested in physical images. We'll see that Japanese poetry is interested in many other things, but the physical image is dominant. And when Western poets were discovering Japanese poetry for their own traditions in the late 1800s and early 1900s, one of the things you see that's picked up on very quickly by Western writers, especially American writers, is, oh wow, Japanese poetry is so much more interested in image than we've ever been in the West. Now, I don't know that that's fair to say, but it certainly is something that we could think of as a kind of highlighting and hiding issue in poetry. When we think a lot about sound, sometimes questions of image or very physical description take a back burner. They're kind of hidden or less important if we're thinking about sonic structures. If we start thinking about images and crafting, exquisite, very detailed physical descriptions, maybe we'll be less inclined to think about sonic things. Now, of course, the best poets can do both well, and know when to focus us on an image and know when to draw us into the beauty of sound. Japanese poetry is a poetry that rewards slowing down. If you're reading, say, Spenser's Faerie Queene or Milton's Paradise Lost or Shakespeare's Hamlet, you have to have some endurance. You have to sit down and say, okay, I'm gonna barrel through this, difficult long narrative. Japanese poetry, for the most part, is very, very short. Even its longer poems, say in the late Heian period, or in the early shogunate periods, these are poems of, 5 lines, 10 lines. Short Japanese poetry is 3 lines. So Japanese poetry asks us to slow down. And as we begin to look at Japanese poetry, it's okay to kind of take a breath and begin thinking small. Small doesn't mean insignificant. Small means a different pace.